Elijah and the whirlwind. Now, when the Lord was about to take up Elijah into heaven by a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. And Elijah said to Elisha, "Please stay here, for the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel." But Elijah replied and said, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel, and the sons of the prophets who were there at Bethel came out to Elisha and said to him, "Do you know today that the Lord will take away your master from over you?" And Elisha said, "Yes, I know it. Keep quiet." Then Elijah said to him, "Elisha, please stay here, for the Lord has sent me as far as Jericho." But he said, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they came to Jericho. And the sons of the prophets who were there at Jericho drew near to Elisha and said to him again, "Do you know that today the Lord will take away your master from over you?" And he answered, "Yes, I know it. Be quiet." Then Elisha said to Elisha again, "Please stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So the two of them went on. Now 50 men of the sons of the prophets also went and stood at some distance from them, as they both were standing by the Jordan. Then Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the water. And the water was parted to the one side and to the other, till the two of them could cross over on dry ground. Now when they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Ask what I shall do for you before I am taken from you." And Elisha said, "Please, let there be a double portion of your spirit on me." And he said, "You have asked a hard thing, yet if you see me as I am being taken from you, it shall be so for you. But if you do not see me, it shall not be so." And as they went on and talked, behold, chariots of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. And Elisha saw it, and he cried out, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." And he saw Elijah no more. Then he took hold of his own clothes, and he tore them into pieces. And he took up the cloak of Elijah that had fallen from him, and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. When he took the cloak of Elijah that had fallen from him, he struck the water with it, saying, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" And when he had struck the water was parted to the one side and to the other, and Elisha went over. Suppose I was to ask you this morning to explain to me the significance of the four following phrases. The Oscars, Chris Rock, Will Smith, and a slap. How many of you, before 2 weeks ago, would have thought, what? The Oscars? Will Smith, Chris Rock, and a slap? What, did Will Smith slap his knee while he was listening to a joke by Chris Rock at the Oscars? What kind of significance is there in those phrases, Jason? And you would be right. There's no significance. There was no significance at that time. But after what happened this last weekend, every one of those phrases is brimming with meaning. You can't hear those four phrases without thinking about the context of Chris Rock making a joke about Will Smith's wife at the Oscars, and Will Smith standing up or walking up onto the stage and proceeding to slap Chris Rock across the face. That particular event and those particular phrases will forever have meaning. Now, when it comes to this the 2 Kings story, who doesn't know about the story of Elijah being taken up into heaven by a whirlwind? The story is probably one of the top 10 in the Old Testament for most well-known of all Bible stories. Right up there with David and Goliath, Elijah and the prophets of Baal, and Moses in the burning bush, right? Now, at first glance, the story seems straightforward enough. Elijah's ministry is just about up. He has been the major prophet of the northern kingdom of Israel for his entire adult life. The northern kingdom of Israel, which broke off from Judah in the south under King Jeroboam, who introduced a rival religion in Israel. If you remember the story, Jeroboam erects 2 golden calves and a new priesthood. He puts one calf up in Dan and another calf, as we will see, at Bethel. So that he makes this new religion to set it off from the religion of the south. And so there, in the north, Israel is governed by a wicked king, and its religion is led by apostate followers. Yet it was Elijah's lot to minister to this northern kingdom, a kingdom which would largely reject him and his message of repentance. And now, for whatever reason, it is time for Elijah to pass on that ministry to Elisha. The ministry which began with him to Elisha. So far, so good. The problem is, upon closer reading, like the story with Will Smith and these phrases that I started out with, there is actually way more significance to the parts of this story than what first meets the eye. And that is what I want to show you here this morning. There are some clues in this tale. There are some details in this narrative. There are some clues here in this story that help to fill in the significance of what is taking place in the lives of Elijah and Elisha as the ministry is being passed from Elijah to Elisha. We tend to think that really this story is mainly or mostly about that transition of power or that transition of ministry, and Elijah's being taken up to the heavens in a whirlwind. But as you will see today, there is far more to the story. So what I want us to do here this morning is I want us to work our way back through this story with our eyes on a number of details that usually get overlooked when we look at this particular story. And we're going to find out that there is far more significance to these seemingly insignificant details than we first imagined. And in order to do that, let's keep our eyes on 2 particular clues that are absolutely essential to the transition of Elijah and Elisha. So clue number one, as we work our way through this, an unmistakable pattern. Clue number 1, an unmistakable pattern. Verse 1. Now when the Lord was about to take up Elijah up to heaven by a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. And Elijah said to Elisha, "Please stay here, for the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel." So, here we are. the story being introduced for us. And right off the bat, here in verse 1, we see that this story is about the taking away of Elijah to be with the Lord by a whirlwind. We get it introduced for us in verse 1 there. Elijah was about to be taken up to heaven by a whirlwind. Now, it's interesting that at this point here, a whole bunch of verses transpire and a whole bunch of events take place before that actual event actually happens. There's a bunch of details that we are to see. Second, not only notice how this story is introduced, but notice that this particular story is being orchestrated by the Lord. It says the Lord directed Elijah here. It was the Lord who sent him as far as Bethel. This is not Elijah's itinerary or Elijah's doing or Elijah's choice in places to visit on his scenic route before he is taken up into heaven. It is the Lord's doing. God has something very important to teach us in the places that are on Elijah and Elisha's itinerary. So notice that. It is the Lord's doing. And notice number 3, that the city that Elijah is being sent to first, and that is the city of Bethel. And you find that on our map right here. Just going to put a big B right here. Bethel. As I said in the beginning of our message here, Jeroboam put a golden calf in Dan, a golden calf at Bethel, so that none of the people of Israel needed to go down into Jerusalem to worship. Everybody in the northern kingdom could worship at these 2 particular sites, those 2 particular temples. And it was there that the Lord had Elijah travel first. Now, this is going to become more significant as we work our way down through this text. So verse 2, let's keep going. 2 Kings verses 2 to 3. But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel, and the sons of the prophets who were in Bethel came out to Elisha and said to him, "Do you know today that the Lord will take away your master from over you?" And Elisha replied, "Yes, I know it. Keep quiet." Now, it's hard to know the significance of every single portion of this story. But this thing happens twice in the course of the narrative. Elisha is being tested. Elisha is given an opportunity by Elijah to remain where he is, and Elisha's not going to have it. Elisha's going to follow his master from place to place, even though Elijah is going to give him an opportunity to jump ship along the way. Now, I don't know how else to understand that other than Elisha's giving him a test. This is a test. Will Elisha follow his master all the way to the end, no matter what, wherever he travels on his journeys? And it's interesting to think that there would be no transition of power, there would be no transition of prophetic mantle, there would be no transition of ministry from Elijah to Elisha if Elisha jumps ship halfway through. So I think that this particular instance, and the one that's going to come up in the next city, where Elijah does the exact same thing, is an opportunity to test Elisha to see how determined he is to follow his master through to the end. Let's keep going. Verse 4. Then Elijah said to him again, so they're at Bethel, and now Elijah says to Elisha, "Please stay here, for the Lord has sent me to Jericho." Again, this has got to be more than merely Elijah wanting a scenic journey of the land before he's taken up into heaven. No, this is not Elisha's doing at all. This is the Lord's doing. So here is the site of Bethel, the ancient site of Bethel, and from here we go to Jericho. These 2 particular places are important in the history of the people of Israel. I didn't talk about Bethel, but we're going to talk a little bit about Jericho. How many of you would tell me what would be most significant about the city of Jericho in the history of the Old Testament people? Okay, right, yeah. Joshua at the Battle of Jericho, right? So we've got this link to Joshua at Jericho. So that's interesting. And the walls came tumbling down at Jericho, right? All right. So you're like, I don't know what significance that maybe just is a haphazard thing, in the text. Well, let's keep reading and find out if there's more significance. There's more here than what first meets the eye. Verse 4. But he said, so Elisha is going to respond again to Elijah, but he said, as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. So they came to Jericho. Now the sons of the prophets who were at Jericho drew near to Elisha and said to him, do you know that the Lord will take away your master from over you today? And Elisha says, yes, I know it. Be quiet. Now again, that's twice in the story that happens. I honestly don't know exactly why Elisha says that twice. I just don't know. The commentaries, really, in fact, the commentaries are a disgrace when it comes to this story. Because so much of these little indicators in this story, they don't even comment on. And so you're just like scratching your head, you're scratching your ears going, what is going on here? And I honestly don't know. Whatever it is, Elisha does not want to talk about it. Is it his grief over the fact that Elijah is going to be taken from him? Possibly. That's probably the best guess that most commentators give. But we just don't know. And so we keep going. Verse 6. Now we get more. 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 6. Then Elijah said to Elisha for a third time, please stay here in Jericho, for the Lord has sent me to where? The Jordan River. Interesting. So 3 times it is the Lord who directs Elijah and Elisha to Bethel, to Jericho, and then on to this particular place at the Jordan River. So when you think of the significance of the site of Jericho, and now we think of the significance of the site of the Jordan River, what comes up in your mind when you think of the Jordan River? Okay, let's stay in the Old Testament. Yeah, let's stay in the Old Testament. The Israelites coming into the Promised Land, and what happened at the Jordan River? So it's interesting. So you have Bethel, Jericho, Jordan River crossing. Let's find out what actually happens in this particular story at the Jordan. Verse 6 and 8. But he said, Elisha says again, as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. He's persistent. He wants to go all the way to the end with his master. So the 2 of them went on, and 50 men of the sons of the prophets also went and stood at some distance from them. And as they were both, as they were both standing at the Jordan, then Elijah takes up his cloak, rolls it up, and strikes the Jordan River. And the water was parted to the one side and to the other, till the 2 of them could go over on dry ground. Now, what does this remind you of? We've talked about this already, but there's more. What does this bring up in your mind? Well, it brings up first the Jordan River crossing, right? And what happened on that particular day when the Israelites crossed the Jordan River, right? The Ark of the Covenant, the priests, the Levites are carrying the Ark of the Covenant ahead of the people. And it says as soon as their feet touched the water, the waters parted, and they parted to the one side, so that everything flowing downstream dried up, so that all day long the people of Israel could walk through the Jordan River, the dry Jordan River basin, on dry land until they were all on the other side. Then the priests left the river basin, and the water came in like a flood again. But here in this text, something interesting is different in the story. You notice it? Does the water heap up on one side, up the river, while on the downside, it also it just goes and is dry? No, it says the water is heaped up on both sides. So is it that this is flood stage, and the water is still, and like Moses and the Israelites passing through the Red Sea, God is parting the waters as Elijah and Elisha walk through on dry ground to the outside of the promised land of Israel? I think that's exactly what's going on. So we have these indicators, these places: Bethel, Jericho, the Jordan River, and then Elijah and Elisha are here, somewhere here, outside the land of Israel. And God is going to take up Elijah in a whirlwind to heaven. Let's keep reading. No, let's not keep reading. Let me ask you some more questions. Elijah's taken up into heaven by a whirlwind outside the land on that side of the Jordan River. Who else in Israel's history is taken to be with the Lord on this side of the Jordan River? Moses. Moses' bones are somewhere on the plains of Moab because of his sin against the Lord before the Israelites under Joshua make a conquest into the land of Israel. Now, if we keep going on the story, guess what happens? The Lord takes Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, and then if we keep going here in verses 12 and 14, what ends up happening here is that it says that Elisha tears his clothes because of grief. His master is gone. He tears his clothes. He picks up the cloak of Elijah, and what does he do? He takes it, he slaps the water of the Jordan, and he makes his way back across the Jordan. If you follow the text into chapter 3 and chapter 4, he goes back to Jericho, he goes back to Bethel, and then he goes up into the northern kingdom. Now let me ask you, is that coincidence? Like, is that mere coincidence? All of those factors there in the story, all of those details, all of those little clues? I actually do not think that that is coincidence. In fact, why? Because it says all along the way, God is directing the steps of Elijah and Elisha in doing this. Why would God take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, all the way, go through all of this pattern, only to bring Elisha back into the land where they started off to begin with? No, God is giving us some clues. And for now, we're going to just write out some of these clues here, and we'll pick them up in our second clue. So I want you to notice that I think the story is giving us a pattern. The story, God is intentionally giving us a parallel first between Elijah and Elisha and Moses and Joshua. Notice that Elisha succeeds Elijah where Joshua succeeds Moses in ministry. Not only do we have those two connections, the text is clearly giving us some indications that these people are paralleled in the story, but also that somehow this entire episode is wanting to connect us with the crossing, the Red Sea crossing, and the Jordan River crossing, and the conquest of Canaan. All right? All of those things are like stacking up in this text. This is not coincidence. God is directing this, and he means it to be significant for the meaning of this text. So that's clue number one. Clue number one, an unmistakable pattern in the text. Number two, clue number two, a curious phrase. A curious phrase. Now, in order to see this, we need to go back where we left off on the other, on the east side of the Jordan River here. So here, Elijah and Elisha are on the east side of the Jordan River. And this is the portion that we didn't read, coming here for you in chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. Now, let's pick this up. When they had crossed the Jordan, Elijah said to Elisha, "Ask what I shall do for you before I am taken from you." And Elisha said, "Please, let there be a double portion of your spirit on me." And he said, "Wow, you have asked a hard thing. Yet, if you see me as I am being taken from you, it shall be so for you. But if you do not see me, it shall not be so." Now, the question in these particular verses is what does it mean to be given a double portion of Elijah's spirit? Now, most people, when they think of this particular text, they think that Elisha is asking Elijah for twice as much power in his ministry as Elijah. You know, your miracles and the things that you've done in your life are so powerful. Give me a double portion of that. So it's potency. It's about potency. Like it's about more power to perform these miracles. And I'm not sure if that's actually the case. Because if you analyze the miracles that are done under Elisha and with the miracles done under Elijah's ministry, it's not as though Elisha's are any more powerful than Elijah's. All right? They're all extremely potent. Having said that, it may have to do with quantity. That is, if you were to count up the miracles that Elijah performs, at least in the written text as we have it, there are about 8 miracles that are recorded in the life of Elijah, where in the life of Elisha, 16. So that's kind of interesting. I wonder if it may have to do with the amount of miracles. But I'm not sure if that's the case either. Most people think that this idea of double portion is actually pointing us back farther into the story of Israel, back to Deuteronomy chapter 21. You see, in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 17, it says this about the firstborn son. So these are the laws concerning the firstborn. And it says this: "He, the father, shall acknowledge the firstborn by giving him a double portion." That's exactly what the text says. The father shall acknowledge the firstborn by giving him a double portion of all that he has, for he is the firstfruits of his strength, the right of the firstborn is his. Which is a way of asking for the inheritance of one person to be transferred to another. That is what Elisha is asking for here. He's saying, Elijah, you have been like a father to me. Elijah, you are a father to me. Would you pass on the ministry, the prophetic ministry that you have to me? Give me your inheritance. And that is what Elisha is asking for. And that's why Elijah responds and he says, I can't do that. That's something that only God can do. That's why he says, you have asked a hard thing, yet if you see me as I am being taken from you, it shall be so for you. But if you do not see me, it shall not be so. Which again is just a way of saying, that is God's prerogative. I can't do that for you. But if you see me as I'm being taken from you, then the Lord has answered your request. Let's keep going, because we really haven't got to our curious phrase yet, and that comes in verses 11 and 12. Now, as they still went on and talked together on the way, behold, chariots of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. And Elisha saw it and cried, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. Now, I tell you, this story is just filled with question marks. Like, you're like, what is this? What is this all about? Chariots of fire? We're talking about chariots of fire and horses of fire. And here's the deal. It's not as though the chariots and the horses whisk Elijah up into heaven. You notice that? It says that the chariots of fire and the horses of fire separate the two of them. And how is Elijah taken up into heaven? By a whirlwind. So you see these paintings of Elijah riding in a chariot. That's not the idea. The chariots of fire and horses of fire divide the two of them, and then Elisha stands in the back after this amazing thing has just taken place, and he goes, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And we're all left going, what in the world is going on here? And you should be asking that, because in our minds, we don't see the significance of these things. And we don't notice that God is embedding some things into the story, some clues into the story, to magnify the meaning of Elijah and Elisha's ministry. So what do we make of these two phrases? Well, the first thing we need to do is notice, that in the first instance, these are chariots of what? And horses of what? Of fire. Now, if you're thinking, Old Testament story, Genesis all the way up to the present day, what does fire signify in the Old Testament text? You should be thinking Abraham and a burning fire pot. You should be thinking Moses and a what? Burning bush, right? You should be thinking the people of Israel going through the wilderness and being led by what? A pillar of fire. All of this significant of the presence of God. These are God's chariots. These are God's horsemen that come in between Elijah and Elisha. But then there's more. Elisha goes on to say, Yes, but there's this phrase, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. So now we get more. Somehow these chariots are being connected to the nation. And you're still scratching your head and going, what's going on here? Well, there's more. If you go on in the story in 2 Kings and you think of Elisha's life, chariots and horsemen are coming up all over the place. At the end of Elisha's life, Elisha is sick in bed, and he is about to be taken up to be with the Lord, not in a whirlwind, but by his sickness. And the king in chapter 13, verse 14, it says this, when Elisha had fallen sick with the illness of which he was to die, Joash, the king of Israel, went down to him and wept before him, crying, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. So the phrase comes up with Elijah. The phrase comes up in regards to Elisha. And you see some of the connections being made here, and you're still asking, what does this have to do with anything? But there's more. So somehow, this statement, this phrase, this title, whatever it is, this phrase is connected to Elisha and Elijah, but there's more. In Elisha's life, just prior to this, in 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 14 to 17, we read of another instance where chariots of fire and horses of fire appear. And if you remember the story, it's in chapter 6. If you remember the account, there's this account during the life and ministry of Elisha as the king of Syria is warring against the king of Israel. When the Syrian king becomes frustrated because every time he decides to move his army to a secret location to get an advantage over Israel, somehow Israel figures out and outsmarts them. And so with his advisors, one day the king is like, I don't get this. How can the people of Israel, the nation of Israel, figure me out like this? Every time I go to make a battle plan, they figure me out. And that's when one of the king's servants says, guess what? I think it's probably Elisha. I think it's probably the prophet Elisha. It is said that he can tell the king of Israel the words that he speaks in the privacy of his own bedroom. To which the king replies, really? If that's true, we need to take this guy out. And that's what brings us to 2 Kings 6. So the king of Syria sent horses and chariots and a great army. And they came by night and surrounded the city. When the servant of Elisha rose early in the morning and went out, and behold, an army with horses and chariots were all around the city there to capture Elisha. And the servant said, Alas, my master, what shall we do? And he said, Don't be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And Elisha prayed and said, O Lord, please open my servant's eyes that he may see. So the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw. And behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. Now, what I'm about to suggest here this morning is that all of these indicators are not haphazard in the text that we have before us in 2 Kings. You see, God is up to something here, and he wants us to see it, if we have eyes to see it. The things that connect the story of Elijah and Elisha with Moses and Joshua, the Red Sea, the Jordan River, the conquest of Canaan, the chariots of fire and horsemen, is this. What God is saying is this: the true strength of a nation, a people, a prophet, consists not in the power and might of man, but in the power and might of God. Every one of these events that we have written for us here, every one of these clues have that connecting every single one of them. Chariots and horses in the biblical account are all about power. In fact, they show up very first in the biblical story. Where? In the nation of Egypt. And what did God do with the chariots and horsemen of Egypt? He hurled them into the bottom of the sea. It's all about the might and power of a nation. The conquest of Canaan was about the power of God. The crossing of the Jordan River was about the power of God. The Red Sea crossing was about the power of God. And the ministry of Moses and Joshua was all about the power of God. Listen to this. When the Israelites, after the Israelites crossed the Red Sea in Exodus 15, verses 1 to 6. What does Miriam, Moses, sing? I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength, not chariots or horsemen. The Lord is my strength and my song. Pharaoh's chariots and his host he has cast into the sea. Your right hand, O Lord, glorious in power. All of these things are about the power of God. The ministry of Moses was about the power of God. The crossing of the Red Sea was to display in all the earth the power of Israel's God. The crossing of the Jordan was linked to the Red Sea crossing, and it was all about the power of God. And the conquest of Canaan under the leadership of Joshua was all about the power of God. What did the people do at Jericho? They did nothing but circled the city, and the walls came tumbling down. What happened at Ai, Bethel, when the nation of Israel came that far and under Joshua's ministry? They merely showed up, and God sent his hornet ahead of them, and the nations fell. They went up into Canaan, and the nations fell. And it wasn't by the power and might of Israel. It was by the power and might of God. And when Joshua walked through to the other side of the Jordan River, and they put up 12 stones at Gilgal, it says this: and Joshua set up 12 stones at Gilgal that they had taken out of the Jordan River. And he said to the Israelites, in the future, when your descendants ask their parents, what do these stones mean? Tell them, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us until we crossed over. And he did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful. It's all about, the whole thing is all about the power and might of God. All of those indicators God is saying to Elijah and Elisha and to the nation of Israel and to us this morning. It's all about my power and not the people's. And that's why when Joshua went into the nation, into the promised land, the Lord said, when you see the nations, do not panic. When you see their armies, and when you see the chariots, and when you see the horses, do not fear. Do not be in dread of them, Deuteronomy 20. For the Lord your God goes with you to fight for you against your enemies, to give you the victory. And even more than that, in Joshua 11, verse 6, the Lord says to Joshua, do not be afraid of them. Speaking of the nations that he will encounter in the Canaanite conquest. Do not be afraid of them, because by this time tomorrow I will hand all of them slain over to you, Israel. But you are to do this when you see their chariots and horses. You are to hamstring them all. You're not to take them for war horses. And you know what you're supposed to do with those chariots? I want you to burn them. Why? Why? Because if the Israelites are going to get no glory over their victories, only God. God says, in a sense, so why does he say that? Chariots and horses were super useful and powerful if you want to take an enemy out. And not only that, they're valuable. You as a nation, you just trample over the enemy with chariots and horses. And God says when he says you're to hamstring their horses and burn their chariots, it's as if God is saying, I will have none of it. Because at the end of the day, if you amass the means to secure your own victory, Israel, who gets the glory? Israel gets the glory. But if God is your power, if God is your might, and God is your strength, like he was for both the ministries of Elijah and Elisha from beginning to end, then God gets all the glory and not them. And so, church, this morning, the significance of all these clues in the story of Elijah and Elisha is this. It's more than merely the passing of the baton from Elijah to Elisha and nothing more. No, all of these indicators, all of these clues, all of these little details in the story are God orchestrated to fill in the meaning of the ministry of Elijah and Elisha in a profoundly powerful way. The true strength of a nation, a people, a church, an individual is not found in themselves, but it's found in the power of God. Now, there are a whole host of ways we could end after this. We could think of the power of the Word of God that creates new life in everyone whom God chooses. You know, in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, chapter 1, it talks about the power of the message of God, the power of the cross, the power of the Word. We could talk more about that. We could also talk about the power of God's Spirit indwelling each and every one of us. At the end of the day, anything good that happens in your life and in my life ultimately is because of the power of the Spirit of God. We could also talk about the power of prayer. Have you ever thought about prayer? Like, seriously. Sometimes I think in my baser moments of all the things to do that I have nothing to show for is prayer. Right? To get on my knees for a half hour or 45 minutes in the morning or at any point in my day to pray, and I have nothing to show for that 45 minutes. Because I'm the kind of person who loves to do stuff and to find and to see the progress after I do it. But prayer shows our absolute and utter dependence, not on my power, but on the power of God. There are so many things that we could say in response to this. I don't know about you this morning, but maybe the Lord is speaking to you this morning and saying, you're just operating a little bit too much in your own strength and not dependent enough on me. And I know for me this morning, that's what he's saying to me. And so this morning, as we close, let me remind you that the true strength of a nation, a people, a prophet, a church, consists not in the power and might of man, but in the power and might of God. Let's pray as we close.